Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a place where the air smells faintly of beeswax and rosewater, and the shadows move just enough to make you wonder if they're alive. You're standing in a long, dim hallway lined with heavy oak doors, each carved with a crest you don't quite recognize. Somewhere a torch sputters, and the soft hiss of its flame is the only sound breaking the stillness. Ahead, a door stands slightly ajar, spilling a strip of warm golden light across the cold stone floor. That, you realize, is the royal bedchamber, a place where power has been whispered, bargained, and sometimes stolen in the dead of night. You probably wouldn't last long here, not because of any blade or poison, but because the politics woven into these walls are sharper than either. Or so, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey. Together, you push open the door and step into velvet shadows. The bed is massive, a fortress of carved walnut and draped silk. The canopy hangs low, trapping the warmth of a nearby brazier. On a table, a half-melted candle leaks wax onto a sheet of parchment, its ink still glistening. The scent of lavender mingles with something fainter, perhaps the oil from the queen's hair. She is not here now, but her presence clings to every embroidered pillow, every folded gown. Historians still argue whether this particular chamber belonged to a woman of great influence or a monarch more ornamental than powerful. The records are conflicted. One scribe's account calls her the shadow that guided the crown, while another dismisses her as the rose in the garden, beautiful but without root. What's certain is that this space was not merely a place to rest. It was a theatre. Here ministers would bow low, whispering matters of state while pretending to discuss fabrics. Here alliances would be born over shared goblets of mulled wine, and enemies dismissed with a glance toward the door. The bedchamber was the one place in the palace where rank blurred. A servant might carry a sealed letter from the queen's hand to a distant noble, bypassing the king entirely. A lady-in-waiting might deliver advice that reshaped a tax law. Power here flowed quietly, like the coals in the brazier, glowing steadily, rarely flaring, but impossible to extinguish. In the far corner, you notice a low chest bound in iron. The lock is ornate, shaped like a lion's head, its teeth gripping the keyhole. Legends say queens kept everything from private correspondence to contraband within such chests. Hairpins tipped with sleeping draughts, or silken ribbons steeped in perfume strong enough to mark a lover's cloak for days. Some claimed these were idle tales, others swore by them as truth, passed down by the granddaughters of servants who once dusted these very floors. And then there is the tapestry, a scene of a hunt, wild stags bounding through a forest of emerald thread. But if you look closely, behind the weft of branches, a single figure stands apart, a woman in a crown, holding no bow, no spear, just a scroll, a hint, perhaps, at the real hunt that played out behind closed doors. You run your fingers along the stone wall, cool and slightly rough. Somewhere beyond, the muffled murmur of the great hall seeps in, but here it's distant, another world entirely. And that's the thing about the royal bedchamber. It was both sanctuary and snare. Queens could shape the course of a kingdom from these silken shadows, but they could also lose everything if they missed. Tonight, you'll hear about the women's history tried to erase from these walls, the quiet rulers, the whisperers, the ones who changed the course of nations, not in battlefields, but in candlelit rooms like this. Their stories have survived. in fragments, half-truths, and rumors, but stitched together, they form something richer. And you're here now, close enough to feel the threads. You move deeper into the room, your eyes adjusting to the buttery glow of candlelight. Every surface here is deliberate. The carved bedposts etched with roses that never wilt. The silver mirror leaning at an angle just sharp enough to catch anyone slipping through the door. A place like this is as much a stage as any court, and its leading lady is Eleanor of Aquitaine. She's not here in person tonight, but her story lingers like perfume. You picture her poised at the edge of that great bed, skirts pooling like a tide around her feet, a goblet in one hand and a map in the other. Eleanor was a woman whose influence ran through two kingdoms, first as Queen of France, then as Queen of England, a feat that sounds impressive enough in dusty history books. But in this chamber, you can almost hear the soft cadence of her voice as she persuaded men to do the impossible. Historians still argue whether her power came from cunning, political genius, or the careful cultivation of a dangerous kind of charm. Some say she held sway because she understood exactly what to say and when, not just to kings, but to the chambermaids, the guards, and the bishops, weaving their loyalties together like threads in a tapestry. Others claim she simply had the luck of being beautiful, wealthy, and in the right place at the right time. But here, in the stillness, you can sense there was nothing accidental about her reign. The bedchamber was her war room. Beneath the canopy, maps were unrolled, treaties read in low voices, while the scent of mulled wine curled in the air. She knew the value of privacy, that a king might bluster in the great hall, but here in the quiet, decisions could be made. Without an audience, you imagine her leaning forward, the candlelight catching the gold in her hair, whispering instructions to a trusted envoy who would ride out before dawn. And of course, there were the stories that never made the official record, the hints of clandestine meetings with troubadours who sang more than just songs, or the cryptic letters folded into embroidery hoops, stitched over with patterns no one would think to unpick. One particularly persistent rumor claimed she kept a small silver box hidden under the floorboards, filled with miniature portraits of allies, each painted on ivory, each with a folded scrap of paper tucked behind. In this soft, golden light, it's easy to believe. You run a hand across the embroidered bedspread, feeling the faint ridges where thread meets thread. This was a place where kingdoms could be reshaped, not by armies, but by the murmur of a queen's voice in the dead of night. You step away from Eleanor's lingering presence, the velvet curtain brushing your shoulder as though reluctant to let you go. Beyond, the corridor twists into another chamber, this one cooler, the air tinged with the faint aroma of beeswax, polish, and iron. The light is softer here, as if the room itself prefers shadows. This is where Isabella of France once sat, the queen whose beauty was praised in ballads, yet whose smile was a rarity. Isabella's stillness was famous. Even at grand banquets, she often remained composed, her gaze level and unblinking, as though she could see the shape of the conversation before it even unfolded. Historians still argue whether her reserved manner was born of shyness, calculation, or the constant undercurrent of distrust she felt toward her husband, King Edward II. Whatever the truth, in this room, it's easy to imagine her silence as a weapon letting others speak themselves into corners while she sipped her wine in deliberate calm. On the carved desk against the wall sits a chest no bigger than a bread loaf, banded in brass. One chronicler swore it held a collection of finely crafted chess pieces, each carved to resemble members of the court, a queen for herself, a king who was not quite her husband, and pawns whose features bore uncanny resemblances to ministers and lords. Whether that was a poet's invention or a sly political commentary is unclear, but you can't help picturing Isabella setting those pieces in careful order on a winter evening, contemplating her next move. She was called the She-Wolf of France in later years, though that name seems far too loud for the woman you imagine here, leaning over a letter, the quill scratching like the faint patter of rain. The letter is short, an invitation, perhaps, but its folded edges are sealed with wax, bearing no official crest. It is here, in the half-light, that whispers become strategies, and strategies become history. From outside, the muffled sound of boots on stone drifts in, but Isabella doesn't turn her head. Her eyes stay fixed on the page. The fire pops softly in the grate. In a place like this, you realize the most dangerous conversations were often the ones never spoken aloud. You lift the canopy's edge, and the dust dances tiny gold flecks wobbling in the candlelight like lazy snow. The mattress ropes creak as you ease your weight against the bed frame, and there, between the slats and a loose board, you find the thing every courtier fears and every gossip lives for. A bundle of letters tied with silk, the knot double-looped in a way that says, "Please don't open me," which, of course, means the opposite. The ribbon smells faintly of rose, attar, and Dodley ink. Queens learn early that perfume disguises everything, even secrets. Your fingers hover. You tell yourself you are only rescuing them from dust. But the bedchamber has its own gravity. It tugs at curiosity, turns caution into courage. You slip the bundle free and feel the tremor of a story waiting to be told. The first page is folded into a slim triangle, the way travelers fold notes so they won't rattle inside a saddlebag. The handwriting is elegant but hurried, the descenders long like fishing lines cast into deep water. To my sovereign star, it begins safe enough and then proceeds in the dangerous language of metaphors. Moons eclipsed stars that guide hearts that burn. The problem with metaphors is that they don't testify well. Still, they sing. Historians still argue whether moments like this truly unmade dynasties or if letters were merely props in dramas already decided by armies and taxes. But here, with the canopy hemming you in like a stage curtain, it's easy to believe a sheet of paper could topple a hall full of men in mail. A second letter slides free, and the seal on this one bears a hunting horn. Your pulse ticks. The horn turns up in the margins of certain royal accounts, particularly the scandal that blew through France in 1314, like a winter Galtha a fair later, nicknamed for the tower on the Seine. The mainstream fact is blunt. Members of the royal family were accused of adultery with 2 Norman knights. Punishments were swift and theatrical, and a chill fell over the dynasty. Chroniclers wrote of clandestine meetings and embroidered purses that matched the princess's linens. A coincidence that sounds like a comedy of wardrobe errors until you remember the ending. Somewhere in the archives, a clerk probably still winces at the line item for replacement pillowcases. You smooth the page against your palm. The ink leaves a faint glimmer on your skin, as if it were mixed with ground shell. A fringe tidbit, whispered by an old palace laundress, says the queens sometimes scented their stationery, not with rosewater, but with a blend of clove and orange to ward off moths. The unintended result, a letter that smelled like a winter feast. Romantic, perhaps, incriminating, absolutely. If a knight's cloak carried the same spice, noses talked before tongues did. The bed sighs as you sit, canopy tassels tinging softly like tiny bells. You read a line aloud under your breath, "We will meet where the river folds," and the phrase lands with the delicacy of a harp pluck. It could mean the landing by the water stairs. It could mean nothing. Political paranoia is a full-time chore here. You imagine a queen, let's say, a clever, restless one, married to a man whose affection was more ceremonial than sincere, pressing these pages beneath her mattress, trusting the bed that bears her to also bear her secrets. Beds are good at that. They hold and hold and hold until they don't. Beyond the door you hear the soft scuff of a guard changing his stance. Every noise is amplified at night, like the palace breathes louder when it knows you're listening. You retie the ribbon to prove to yourself you can, and then untie it again, which is, admittedly, how people get caught. Light joke 1. Medieval rule of thumb: if you've opened it twice, you own it morally. A third letter floats up, its edges singed. That's new. Someone once tried to burn this, thought better of it, or was interrupted by the very footsteps you now hear. The parchment curls slightly, and the words bend with it, transforming favor into fervor, which is, you admit, a more honest spelling for love, written in a palace where favors are just politics in perfume. The writer thanks the queen for a keysmall brass with a lion's mouth. Your mind jumps to the iron-bound chest you saw earlier, the lion's teeth gripping the keyhole. You picture a tryst, not in the bed, but in the archive. Romance, but with receipts. Breath soft, shoulders loose. You remind yourself you are only a witness. Queens have always kept correspondences that dripped with feeling and strategy in equal measure. Eleanor had messengers who rode at night. Isabella, with her measured gaze, understood that what she did not write mattered as much as what she did. And then there were women whose names rarely surface except as ripples, princesses whose letters crossed the river in breadbaskets, abbesses who hid wax tablets inside reliquaries so no man in armor would dare pry. You angle the candle closer. Wax pools like amber sap around the wick. The glow warms the page, and for a moment you feel the writer's presence, as if he stood just behind your shoulder, too close for etiquette, close enough for scandal. He mentions the color of the queen's gown, mulberry-and, the sound her sleeves made a hush of silk when she reached to take the sealed purse. Another line references a music hour, a lute, 3 songs, a broken string. If a steward were cataloguing this, he'd call it nothing. If a bishop read it, he'd call it everything. Light joke 2. Confession queue on Monday would be around the block and halfway to the bakery. There is, tucked deep in the bundle, a small scrap, not of parchment, but of fabric mulberry, as advertised. It's stitched at the corner with a golden thread that catches the light like a wink. Hidden in the hem, your nail finds something stiff, a prayer written on paper thin as onion skin, tiny as a fingernail. You coax it out with the delicacy of a surgeon and read the words, "Deliver us from careless words." You almost laugh. The bedchamber says, "Amen." Historians still argue whether the most famous of these bed-born scandals were consequences or causes. Did letters like these embolden queens to claim a sliver of joy in lives traded like treaties, or did they merely give enemies the excuse they were hunting for? In the French affair, the proof offered to the public was lurid and simple. The truth, like the river, probably folded in more than one place. And then there's the quiet question. No chronicle writes. How many bundles like this were never found because a lady-in-waiting with better sense and faster hands reached the bed first? You retie the ribbon once more, 3rd time's the charm. And also the indictment, light joke 3. If the ribbon starts recognizing you, it's time to stop. Carefully, you slide the packet back into the space between board and rope, where the mattress presses down like a mother hen. The canopies fringe tickles your temple as you lean in, and the centrose clove ink settles over you like a thin shawl. A draft nudges the candle, and the flame gutters, steadies, then continues its patient work. That's how whispers move through palaces. They falter, adjust, and burn on. Outside the door, the footsteps recede. Somewhere, a clock, one of those new ones the king shows off, clinks a measured note. Queens count time differently. Their hours are stitched into letters, pressed into wax, hidden in hems, buried beneath beds. You let the canopy fall back into place. The bed stands as it did before. Massive, innocent, utterly unconvincing. Power loves a quiet room. It thrives in soft light, sharp ink, and silk ties that can be undone with a breath. Tonight, you've only borrowed a story already written. Tomorrow, someone else will lie here and think the boards don't creak. And the letters will keep breathing even when no one reads them. You follow a corridor that bends like a river around stone, then open onto a balcony where the night breathes cold and clean. The mountain air tastes of snowmelt and pine sap, and far below, torchlights stipple the terraces of a hilltop city. You are in Tbilisi, high in the Caucasus, and the palace here does not whisper. It hums quietly, like a lyre string held just shy of sound. Within these walls, a queen wears a crown that is velvet outside and steel beneath. Her name is Tamar, and if the bedchamber is the theatre of power, this one is the royal box and the backstage in a single room. You move past a door studded with bronze rosettes, into warmth smelling of beeswax and pomegranate wine. The bed is narrower than the huge northern beds and set lower. The canopy embroidered with golden vine scrolls that catch the candlelight in tiny constellations on a table. Wax tablets, a bronze oil lamp shaped like a fish, a reliquary the size of your palm. There is also a manuscript propped on a lectern parchment aglow under a sheet of polished horn, and you recognize the opening lines. A court poet has dedicated his epic to a sovereign who shines like the sun. The mainstream fact rests. As easily as the lamp's flame, Shota Rustavelli composed The Night in the Panther's Skin in honor of Queen Tamar's reign, and under her, Georgia experienced what historians love to call a golden age. She prefers to meet herein the soft light, not the blare of a throne room where voices level out and men forget to perform. Her chamber attendants step like swallows, swift and nearly silent. A scribe sits cross-legged near the brazier, scraping a quill. A guard waits beyond the curtain, more shadow than man. You can imagine the queen herself, wool mantle over her shift, hair braided and looped like a rope of dark honey, leaning over a map, not for romance, but for roads. She has ruled since 1184, not as a consort, not as an ornament, as sovereign, styled in charters as King of Kings to make her equality unmistakable. Light joke 1. Nothing says don't test me like upgrading your job title 2 notches before breakfast. On the bed, a folded cloak. Its hem is heavy with a border of gold thread, and stitched inside the lining you find something small and cool, a signet seal carved with a winged creature mid-stride. A fringed tidbit tells that certain seals in Tamar's court were fitted onto rings that unscrewed into 2 parts, one public, one private, so a letter could travel with one face and be answered with another. In a palace where the wrong crest can undo you, an adjustable ring is the sort of jewelry that earns its drawer space. A page arrives with a carafe. The room fills with the soft spice of clove and cinnamon as he pours. He waits for her word, then slips away, leaving you with the gentle pop of the brazier and the feel of a country stretching like a cloak beyond. These walls, if you listen, you can hear hooves under the murmur, the campaign to the east, where Shemker became a bright note on the royal staff in 1195, the thunder to the west, Bayesian some years after, where banners staggered and then steadied. Under the Queen's standard, historians still argue whether Tamar herself planned those deployments, or whether she simply blessed and bounded them. But in a room like this, with maps and men and a scribe whose pen never seems to stop, you suspect simply does a lot of heavy lifting. There is a small niche set into the wall, draped with silk. You touch the edge, the fabric sighs. Inside sits a tiny icon and a folded parchment. The parchment is not an ordinance or an edict. It is a list of names, some crossed through, some circled. Alliances breathe here. Loyalties need tending as much as lamps. You remember the letters you tucked back beneath a mattress, earlier perfume and wax sand. You can't help thinking Tamar has no time for scented metaphors. She does her loving at the scale of cities. Monasteries founded, bridges thrown across gorges in a single elegant span. Varzia's cave galleries buzzing with monks like bees in honeycomb mainstream. Historians debate whether to call it her father's project or hers, call it a family hobby, like empire building, but with better acoustics. At the foot of the bed is a chest covered in stamped leather, not as ornate as the lion-locked coffer you met elsewhere, but its straps shine from use. Propped against it is a travel desk, hinged, portable, dotted with ink, constellations, because this sovereign moves when she rides out. The bedchamber follows in pieces. Tent, screen, lectern, lamp, royal sleep becomes a travelling sacrament. If you can pitch a canopy and light a lamp, you can make a government out of thin air. Light joke too, medieval productivity hackif. Your office is a suitcase. You can't be late for your commute. A draft whispers under the door and lifts the edge of a document. You set it back and skim a few lines. Grant of land to a monastery witnessed by names from every stripe of the realm. Nobles, bishops, even urban elders, whose signatures wobble like boats. Tamar's charters often carry her name first, not second, a small alphabetical revolution that signals a larger one. There, under the formalities, is the same steady pulse you felt in Eleanor's quiet and Isabella's gaze. A woman redistributing weight in a building designed to keep it elsewhere. Historians still argue whether the stories of her first marriagery of Russ, imported like a hunting hawk, then sent away like one that refuses the glove, represent a scandal or a syllabus item. Some chronicles paint him drunk and disagreeable. Some paint the nobles opportunistic, some tug their beards and write only, "The Queen remained." If a tapestry could roll its eyes, this chambers would they have seen husbands come and go, and kingships stick. You lift the manuscript on the lectern and read a few lines, Rustavelli spinning loyalty into lace. The parchment glows like skin. There is a rumor that, when the poet read aloud in this very room, his voice snagged on a word and the Queen laughed. Not cruelly, but as if a string had snapped and a bird had flown free. It's a small, human sound in a place that makes people forget they're human. Another rumor says a pavilion in the palace garden was used for choosing which petitions reached the Queen. The petitions were hung from pegs along the inner ring, and whichever ones caught the afternoon light were read first. Bureaucracy, but make it sunrise. You sit on the edge of the bed. The ropes grown old but loyal. The canopy's vine scroll seems to climb as you watch, inching toward the center like ivy hunting sun. In the hallway, the guard clears his throat, a soft foghorn reminding ships not to run aground on privacy. You remember the line-mouthed key from earlier rooms, and wonder what Tamar would lock if she locked anything at all. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps the only key here is the one she wears in her look when a noble begins a speech, and she smiles like someone who has already written the ending. A servant returns with a tray of figs and a small bowl of walnuts, cracks 3 deftly, and withdraws. You taste one dry, warm, slightly sweet. The lamp flickers and the shadows lean. You can feel the bedchamber sorting the world into piles, to bless, to bind, to set aside. The Queen's night is not asleep. It is a sieve. What passes through will nourish tomorrow. What remains will be ground finer and tried again. It would be easy to make her a statue saint of rulers, patron of efficient paperwork, forget that rooms like this hold breath and uncertainty as much as gold and silk. There were nights when the messengers were late, when the mountains kept their secrets, when the sun challenged the mother and the palace remembered its echo. There were victories that felt like fragile glass, and mornings when the sun broke against the city like a wave, and everyone pretended not to flinch. Another page of the charter peeks free and shows a spiral flourish at the end. Of her name Tamerlake, a fish hook, catching history. She will die peacefully, the chronicles say, which reads like a miracle in a book full of men who don't. She will be remembered in stone and song, in mosaics and margins, in the way the city throws shadows from rooftops like a crown that never quite lands. You stand. The balcony calls, and the cold nips like a polite dog at your heels. Outside, the night has cleared, and the stars arrange themselves with a kind of neatness only a queen could truly approve. Somewhere below, a harp begins a tune that sounds like water over stones. You rest your palm on the bedpost and feel the carved vine under your skin, a ladder of leaves that keeps climbing. Velvet outside, steel within, the crown sits lightly. Here, because the neck beneath it learned to be a pillar. And if you're counting light, joke 3, when the poet titled it Panther's Skin. Everyone at court quietly agreed not to ask where the procurement paperwork for one panther hide. When curtains breathe like tame sails when you draw them together, and the room downsizes the world on command. Outside, banners snap in the wind, and armor clinks like hail on eaves. Inside, the bedchamber swallows the noise until it becomes only a rumor of iron. You pad across rushes that smell faintly of mint and straw, and you realize the most important room in the castle is not the hall with its antler trophies, but this for posts, heavy drapes, and a quilt that, tonight, doubles as a map. The Queen Margaret of Anjou works in layers the way tailors work in cloth. She's young still, the sort of young that looks older because responsibility has put weight where sleep should be. She kneels on the coverlet, smoothing a parchment with both palms. The bed protests with a small, good-natured creak. Beds have heard worse. Around her, a tight ring of men and 2 women hover, each minding where they set their elbows. Swords wait outside, voices here wear slippers. The mainstream fact is simple and stubborn as oak. When the Wars of the Roses frayed England in the mid-15th century, Margaret became the engine of the Lancastrian cause. Kings blustered, she organized. Tonight, organized looks like pins pushed through parchment into mattress river crossings secured by straight pins. Friendly lords, marked with red thread, Fords noted in a tidy hand that prefers clarity over flourish. On the pillow, a slate. On the slate, numbers. Light joke 1. Medieval accounting tip: if your pillow knows your troop counts, you're doing bedtime wrong. The room is arranged to keep secrets. The fire's low. The curtains drink the light and sip it back as a warm umber. 2 stools serve as desks. A chest wears a cloak across its lid, the way a guest might wear a borrowed shawl. Every object has an alibi. At the footboard, a narrow table holds bread heels, a trencher smeared with quince paste, and a jug of watered wine. No goblets, wooden cups, do not betray reflections in the doorway. The little things count, especially when big things, Wakefield, Toten loom like weather on the horizon. A captain clears his throat, then stops when the Queen lifts a finger. The way you'd hush a cradle. She's listening to a messenger whose boots are still dusted with snow. His voice shakes, not from fear, but from the speed of his ride. Scouts say the road south is passable by dawn. The Queen nods. Once, then, the dawn is already busy, she says, and it is a line soft enough to pass for affection, and sharp enough to pass for orders. Historians still argue whether Margaret personally set the sequence of winter marches that cornered Yorkist forces near Wakefield in 1460, or whether her northern lords Somerset, Northumberland, Clifford pressed the advantage. Like men trying to outrun their own tempers. From here, with the map wrinkling under her knuckles and the candles making halos on vellum, you suspect the answer is a duet. Their momentum, her metronome, there's a fringe tidbit, half diary entry and half kitchen gossip that says Margaret had the bed hangings redraped inward for councils, so the folds made a second room inside the room. A silk tent within oak, muffling sound as neatly as bread muffles wine. Practical and a little theatrical, which is the brand of wisdom palaces often demand. Another rumor mentions a travel reliquary no larger than a plum-peter sliver of some saint's bone set in gold, that she kept tucked under the mattress seam when decisions felt like tightropes. Superstition? Maybe a placeholder for nerve. Definitely, her steward brings a shallow trather, plain pieces of war, wax seals, spare seal strings, a small dish of sand for drying ink, and 3 tokens carved from bone. Countersigns for the night, to be whispered through gate grills and notched into memory. Crown, ash, lark, they feel like prayers with jobs. She palms them, presses one into each captain's hand, and watches it disappear the way a fisherman watches a line go under. You think of the earlier rooms, the lion-mouthed lock, the perfumed letters stashed between bed slats, and how those secrets glowed like coals. Here the secret is movement. If the hall is where men decide out loud, the bedchamber is where those decisions get a timetable, a packing list, and shoes. Margaret points to a pin near Pontefract and taps twice. Supplies? She murmurs, and word to the kitchens, brown loaves, they travel better than white. The scribe on the stool scratches it down, bread turned policy in a stroke. Light joke too, medieval logistics armies march on stomachs and then complain about the menu in Chronicles forever. A gust puffs the curtains, a candle bows rights itself and leaves a tear of wax on the Queen's sleeve. She doesn't notice. What of the archers? She asks. Their hands? It's a small question with cold fingers. Bowstrings stiffen in sleet. A woman at the back, one of the 2 you clocked earlier, answers that she's had the Fletcher's warm linen wraps with stones near the hearth. There's goose fat, too, 4 pounds. A footnote history rarely writes. Victories smell like grease, and wet wool before they smell like laurel. Time turns elastic in rooms like this. The brazier breathes. The pins become little bright soldiers. You notice a decollaged scrap tucked into the quilt binding. A charm cut from parchment, inked with a short Latin verse and a doodled key. It's the old half-prayer, half-mnemonic, clavis cystoscopia, key, guard, plenty. A housekeeper's mantra, drafted for war. She stands to stretch, and you hear the soft protest of linen under wool. For a moment She looks like any woman whose day has been too full of names. Then the posture returns the spine that remembers thrones and horses in equal measure. She asks for the letter from Scotland. It comes from a stack under the bolster, folded 3 times, damp at the crease. She skims, frowns, smiles. "They will do as we do first," she says, which is diplomacy's oldest punchline. You are close enough now to see how the bed has been enlisted. The footboard holds the no-pile petitions for pardons that will wait until battles stop, making widows faster than signatures can make absolutions. The blanket chest holds coin, counted in little cloth bags that jingle if you breathe wrong. The bolster hides the messages too important for the door, the ones a queen reads between heartbeats. A bed is supposed to keep bodies. This one keeps a kingdom in pieces that must not scatter. Another messenger arrives, snowmelt in his eyebrows. He kneels without ceremony. There is none to spare. The Yorkist banner moved at dusk, he says, but not far. She asks, "Did they sing?" He blinks. "My lady, sometimes men sing when they're afraid of sleeping," she says, and if the room weren't this quiet, the line would vanish like a sigh. You expect a flare of triumph or dread in her face. You get arithmetic. She subtracts distances, adds hours, divides fatigue by ambition. The council nods when she nods, shakes when she doesn't. Historians still argue whether her decisiveness tonight came from heat or from arbitrage for a husband sidelined, son endangered, or the cool discipline of someone who realized early that if she didn't hold the reins, the cart would not only overturn, it would catch fire, roll downhill, and write a ballad about its own bad choices. She gives the order at last, and it lands like a blanket smoothed over cold sheets. Move by moon, keep 2 hedgerows, no horns, no clatter of pots, and for God's sake no torchlight against helmet stars. Don't wear iron. The men nod as if they had thought of it themselves. That is a queen's second job after deciding, letting other people keep a little pride to spend later. When they go in pairs, the way owls leave a tree. The room expands in their absence. The map exhales. She sits again on the edge of the bed, rubs her temple with the back of her wrist, and reaches for the slate on the pillow. She writes 3 names, wipes 2 away with the side of her hand, and leaves the 3rd to dry. The name looks less like a person and more like a weather report. Only then does she notice the wax on her sleeve. She peels it, freer pale, thumb-shaped moonand, sets it on the rim of the candlestick. It will harden, fall, and be swept up with the rushes in the morning. The floor remembers plans better than marble does. Light joke 3. If your housekeeping staff ever publishes their memoirs, historians will have to retire. You ease the curtain an inch and peer at the door. Quiet, somewhere below. A latch clicks, a horse stamps, someone whispers a countersign. You let the curtain fall. The bed stands at its strange attention, linen tight as a held breath, quilt bunched where the map wrinkled it. Pillows not quite square, no prayers spoken aloud, plenty folded into seams. Outside, the banners keep snapping, weather working itself on the fabric like a loom. Inside, the Queen's night shrinks to a pillow's width. She will not sleep much. Queens rarely do when dawn has been invited to carry weight. Tomorrow, men will say the outcome belonged to courage, treachery, or God. In this room, you learn the unromantic secret. It also belonged to pins. 2 warmed bowstrings, 2 brown loaves, 2 countersigns that tasted like words said too softly, and to a bed that learned how to be a table when the hall was too loud to think. The hallways narrow here, as though the castle itself is steering you somewhere specific. The stones underfoot are worn to shallow bowls, proof of centuries of skirts, boots, and slippered feet taking this same route. A final turn opens into a chamber with pale plaster walls and beams so dark they look like ink strokes against parchment. You are in Castile, and the room belongs to Isabella I, the queen who, depending on who tells it, either dreamed a continent into Spain's lap, or signed her name to ventures she only half believed in. Tonight she is alone, except for the distant shuffle of a page in the antechamber. The scent here is frankincense clinging to the canopy and the faint tang of fresh lime wash on the walls. Her bed is simple by royal standards. Walnut frame, linen sheets, wool coverlet embroidered with pomegranates that seem almost ready to burst. On the bedside table lies a crucifix, a tallow candle, and a folded letter whose seal bears not the crown of Castile, but a merchant's mark. The mainstream fact is as square as her jaw. Isabella's reign saw the unification of Spain under her and Ferdinand, the end of Muslim Granada in 1492, and the fateful sponsorship of Columbus's voyage. But here, in the stillness, the grandeur is pared down to ink on paper. She turns the merchant's letter in her fingers, considering. Historians still argue whether her decision to back Columbus was one of vision, faith, or shrewd opportunism in the wake of Granada's fall. A fringe tidbit claims she sometimes met with advisers here rather than in the throne room, especially when the matters were delicate. Trade concessions to foreign merchants, debt renegotiations, whispered proposals of marriage alliances that would never make it to public record. In this bedchamber, diplomacy came in the form of a chair pulled close to the fire and voices lowered. Just above the crackle, you notice a small coffer near the foot of the bed, lid ajar. Inside are rosary beads, a pair of spectacles with thin metal frames, and a pouch of something that smells faintly herbal, perhaps lavender, to ease her sleep, or perhaps a gift from a monastery known for its medicinal teas. The glass in the leaded windows shimmers with the light of the dying candle, turning her reflection into something ghost-like. She smooths the coverlet, then presses the letter flat against it, as though to iron the decision into place. Outside, bells mark the late hour. Here, in this room, a queen's choices lie as quietly as folded linen until morning, when they unfold into history. The castle here rises from the cliff like it grew straight out of the rock, walls as pale as bone under the moon. The wind off the sea is briny, a cool taste that slips even through the narrow windows of the royal apartments. You step into the chamber, and it smells of salt, beeswax, and something faintly medicinal juniper, perhaps steeped in hot water and left to cool. This is Joan of Navarre's domain, and the hush in the room is not the easy hush of sleep, but the taut kind that comes when secrets are coiled under the floorboards. The bed is high and canopied in crimson damask, its hangings thick enough to block both draughts and eavesdroppers. The coverlet has been folded back, revealing linen smooth as parchment. On a nearby stool, a carved ivory comb glimmers in the candlelight, and beside it rests a sealed pouch of coins, its drawstring knotted tight. You recall the mainstream fact. Joan, as Queen of England through her marriage to Henry IV, wielded both charm and influence, and, In her widowhood, she faced accusations of practicing witchcraft against her stepson, Henry V. Historians still argue whether the charges were political maneuvering, superstition, or an excuse to confiscate her wealth. The fringe tidbit that flits through your mind is from a letter preserved in the royal archives. Henry V himself later ordered her release. Though she had spent years in confinement, some say she spent those years plotting her restoration. Others say she kept herself busy by managing her estates through an intricate web of letters, some of which may have passed across a desk, much like the small writing table now pushed against the wall. On that table lies an unlit brass lamp, a quill with its tip dark from recent use, and a stack of folded pages secured by a ribbon. You can almost hear the scratch of the pen, the soft hiss of wax melting for a seal. The chamber, with its guarded light and careful order, feels like a place where decisions are made not by loud decree, but by the slow, deliberate movement of ink across parchment. A queen's power distilled to the stroke of a pen. The palace. Air changes, hear it, cooler, calmer, but edged with the metallic temps of ink and the faint spice of imported cedar. You're in Aragon in the early 15th century, and the chamber belongs to Maria of Castile, Queen of Aragon in her own right, not merely by marriage. She sits near a low table, her back straight, despite the weight of the fur-lined cloak slipping from her shoulders. The bed in the corner is unassuming for a queen's walnut frame, muted damask curtains, but the space hums with purpose. Mainstream fact. When her husband, Alfonso V, was away campaigning in Italy for years, Maria ruled as his lieutenant general, effectively governing the crown of Aragon. She signed decrees, mediated disputes, and kept the machinery of state running without the constant presence of its king. Historians still argue whether her authority was respected out of genuine admiration or because her regency was seen as temporary power on loan, not in full possession. A fringe tidbit lives in the Aragonese archives. Maria corresponded regularly with her husband, often including personal notes about court gossip and household management alongside state matters. One letter reportedly contained pressed flowers. From the palace garden, part sentimental token, part subtle reminder of the home he'd left in her keeping. On a carved chest by the wall, you spot an open ledger and a neatly arranged set of wax seals. One is cracked and worn, likely used for routine decrees. Another, a heavy matrix with elaborate heraldry, is gleaming from recent use. The fire is low, but the room feels warm with the quiet energy of a queen balancing the affairs of a realm from a single, guarded space. Every document, every whispered conversation here shapes the pulse of the kingdom, though beyond these walls few will know it. The palace here smells faintly of beeswax and ripe pears, the scent drifting from bowls placed strategically to sweeten the air. You are in Portugal, early 15th century, and the bedchamber belongs to Philippa of Lancaster, an English princess who became queen consort through her marriage to King Joe I. The room feels both homely and purposeful, a place where tapestries soften the walls, but the corners hum quietly with the presence of papers, ledgers, and sealed scrolls. The bed itself is dressed plainly, without the jeweled ostentation common in other courts, but its canopy bears embroidered badges, her own Lancastrian rose intertwined with the cross of the Order of the Garter. The mainstream fact about Philippa is one of steady influence. She brokered marriages for her children that would later shape Iberian exploration and European politics raised them in the humanist tradition, and cultivated a court known for discipline and learning. Historians still argue whether her influence on the famous illustrious generation of Portuguese princes was the result of deliberate policy or simply the moral gravity she carried in daily life. A fringe tidbit tells of her habit of giving her children books as rewards for their accomplishments, a rarity in an age when most royal gifts were jewels or horses. Here in her chamber, a small lectern by the window holds an illuminated manuscript, its margins crowded with tiny floral designs. Next to it, an unlit candle and a small knife for trimming the wick suggest long hours of reading after the castle has gone quiet. On the coffer at the foot of the bed rests a folded piece of parchment sealed with green wax, the color reserved for significant royal correspondence in Portugal. The firelight flickers across it, hinting at decisions that might guide fleets, shape alliances, or alter the course of a family whose reach would soon extend far beyond these stone walls. This is a queen's private world, softened by domestic order, sharpened by the quiet weight of influence. The chamber feels heavier here, not because of its size, but because of the stillness that has settled like dust over old wood. The shutters are drawn, letting in only thin blades of moonlight, which glance off the polished oak of a writing desk. Pushed close to the bed, you're in Scotland, early 16th century, and this is the private space of Margaret Tudor, sister to Henry VIII and queen consort to James IV. The bed is tall, its canopy dyed a deep blue, stitched with tiny gold thistles. A carved headboard carries the faint sheen of beeswax, polished and repolished over decades. Mainstream fact: after James IV's death at Flodden, Margaret acted as regent for her infant son, James Vian, appointment complicated by her remarriage to the Earl of Angus, which sparked political chaos. Historians still argue whether her choices were driven more by personal survival, political ambition, or sheer miscalculation. On the table rests a folded scrap of parchment, edges softened from being opened and closed too many times. A fringe tidbit from court gossip claimed Margaret had a habit of hiding certain letters in the linings of her gowns, trusting cloth and thread over chests or locks. Somewhere in this room, perhaps under the cushion of that her-backed chair, could be a note whose contents might shift the balance of a fragile regency. The fire has burned low, its embers pulsing faintly in the grate. A small silver bowl on the mantel holds dried lavender, a gentle scent meant to calm the nerves. But even here, in the dim and perfumed quiet, the air feels taut. This is a queen's bedchamber, yes, but also a war room, one where loyalties are tested in whispers and alliances are stitched together as carefully as the embroidery on the bed curtains. The chamber here feels as if it's been holding its breath for centuries. The air is faintly scented with rosewater, though underneath it lingers the sharper smell of old vellum and sealing wax. You're in France, early 14th century, and the room belongs to Joan II of Navarre, a queen who carried a crown balanced precariously between two realms and two powerful kingdoms. The bed is draped in pale linen, embroidered with vine leaves, the work of a master's hand. But it's the writing desk near the window that draws your eye. On its surface, an open book lies face down to protect its page from prying eyes. Mainstream fact: Joan inherited the throne of Navarre in her own right after a long succession dispute, ruling jointly with her husband, Philip III of Navarre. She was also deeply entangled in the politics of France, her birthplace and the seat of much of her early power. Historians still argue whether her reign was defined more by genuine authority or by the diplomatic constraints of being perpetually caught between stronger neighbors. A fringed tidbit whispers from the edges of archival records that Joan preferred to meet certain envoys not in the throne room, but here in her private quarters, with the pretext of a casual conversation over spiced wine. Here, away from courtiers' ears, treaties could be softened, language could be bent, and alliances could be made without anyone else claiming credit. On the coffer at the foot of the bed lies a small silver reliquary, its surface worn smooth. From touch, the candle beside it has burned low, pooling wax along its base. The light plays across the walls, illuminating a series of stitched tapestry scenes, not of war or saints, but of gardens in bloom. In this space, power is not loud. It's folded into every deliberate gesture, every word measured like cloth. Before it's cut, the corridor narrows to a throat, then opens into a chamber whose quiet feels almost legal. You know the kind hush, so deep it has paperwork. Westminster is outside somewhere, bell-heavy and busy. But in here the sound is felt rather than heard, like a hand on a door you don't open. The bed is modest for a queen's, its canopy stitched with white roses and a border of acorns, and on the pillow a little wool cap rests as if it's guarding the place. This is where a monarch disappears without moving an inch. Her name is Elizabeth Woodville, Queen Consort to Edward IV, and twice in her life she unthreaded herself from public sight so cleanly the kingdom had to squint to find her again. The mainstream fact is sturdy enough to lean on. In 1470 and again in 1483, Elizabeth took sanctuary at Westminster, retreating behind church immunity just as the political tide turned sharp. Tonight you feel the edges of that choice: the bed, a harbour, the curtains, a sea-wall, the floor, a boundary line inked in Latin and habit. Sanctuary is not silence, it's a new grammar. The precinct has rules older than tempered steel. Debtors can't be dragged out, soldiers must unbuckle at the threshold, and even kings knock differently here. Inside the Queen's room the air smells of beeswax and old parchment. Outside, the sanctuary stones, weathered markers set at the limits of the Abbey's protection stone, like punctuation in the streets. A fringe tidbit from an old list claims the Abbey's cooks once sent brown loaves nightly through a little postern to the hidden household, so the oven's smoke wouldn't betray how many mouths were eating within. Light joke 1. Medieval wellness trend: go low-profile carbs when you're avoiding arrest. You picture Elizabeth the first time, autumn 1470, her husband in exile, her enemies thick as crows, climbing these steps with her daughters and a belly as full of the future as a tide moon. She laboured here and delivered us Edward, the boy the city would later call King Edward V for a heartbeat on. The bedchamber became a crown room without trumpets. The mattress ropes creaked. A midwife swore under her breath. A clerk fetched ink. The child's first cry slipped under a door guards would not cross. It is an odd thought that a kingdom can change registers like a choir from bronze to linen without moving the staff lines. Historians still argue whether that first vanishing was caution or choreography. Did Elizabeth choose sanctuary because she read the winds a day faster than anyone else, or because she understood how well a consecrated wall can deflect not only swords but stories? In sanctuary, enemies must talk politely. Gossip trips over Latin. Here she could receive messengers under the Abbey's eye, write letters in a hand nobody could accuse of shaking, and let London guess poorly. The great hall shouted, the bedchamber counted. You rest your palm on the coverlet and feel, faintly, stitch after stitch, like a line of soldiers. There's a small coffer at the foot of the bed, leather-scuffed lid, bowed with use. Inside, a rosary with worn beads, a little bone comb, and a folded parchment stamped with the abbey's seal list of sanctuary rites copied for the queen. You skim rite of hearth, rite of bread, rite of messenger under escort. The lines are crisp, but the edges are blurred with handling. Law becomes talisman. Paper becomes a door you carry. The second vanishing tastes different from the first. It's April 1483. Edward IV is dead. The spring has that treacherous sweetness London uses to bait traps. Elizabeth has learned sanctuaries, corridors by heart, and yet this return has more iron in it. Her eldest boy is fetched to greet his Uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Her younger son clings to her skirts. There's a footnote you can feel even if you never read it. The day the boy leaves sanctuary, some said promises were made as steady as stone. Some said promises were made of water. The door closed, and history held its breath. The bedchamber remembers the pressure of that hour like a bruise. The Queen's ladies packed a small chest, shirts, a prayer book, a lion-mouthed key that does not fit any lock in this room, but fits the habit of queens to keep keys even when doors change. A monk stood by with a hand raised in blessing, and somewhere nearby a clerk prepared a list of what was borrowed from the abbey and must be returned: candles, cups, memory. Light joke too. Inventory note: one future king on loan. The steward crosses it out before the ink dries. Sanctuary's fabric is practical as much as pious. There's a screened hatch where bread passes and talk does not. There's a set of grills through which a confessor hears sins the city can't charge. There's chalk on the floor marking where a crown may not order. A whispered tidbit clings to the precinct like ivy that an abbey cat wandered freely between worlds, slipping through grates a guard could not, and that the Queen's youngest daughter fed it pottage from her own bowl. You smile at the image. Sovereignty reduced to cat diplomacy. The animal belongs to no one, and is warmly greeted by all, which is what power wishes it could claim as a hobby. Historians still argue whether Elizabeth later compromised with Richard for survival, whether she sent her daughters to court in nodding acceptance or in veiled defiance, whether her correspondence with the future Henry VII was the measured thread. Behind the tapestry we now hang and call Tudor, the record is an obedient servant when men speak, and a talented liar when rooms like this do the talking. What we can hold is this: she vanished from sight in a way that felt like a trick of light, and when she returned, she had rearranged enough furniture that the room wasn't the same. The royal bed stands patient. On its bolster, a narrow writing board lies with a quill tucked into a ribbon loop. You think of the other rooms you've seen: the bundle of letters, perfumed and perilous. Tamer's travelling desk, Margaret of Anjou's bed, turned, mappened, it clicks. Disappearing is also a kind of work. It's not absence, it's negative. Space shaped by will. A queen can withdraw a body the way you withdraw a dagger, as part of the plan. After Bosworth, when the city tries new hymns and new colours, Elizabeth recedes again. The second vanishing is quieter Bermondsey Abbey, a place of comfort framed as retirement, or retirement framed as policy. She lives simply. White veil, rules kept, receiving daughters and grandchildren like parcels one day and angels the next. Months pass, measured by church hours and river fog. A ledger notes small alms, a window notes the Thames. The court speaks her name less and less. Somewhere a laundress remembers a queen who liked brown loaves, a habit learned in sanctuary and never unlearned. Light joke 3. Once you go brown, you don't go crown. At least for breakfast. Was she sent there to be out of the way? Did she choose it because choosing steals the teeth from exile? Historians still argue whether Bermondsey was a soft prison or a quiet throne, whether the widow of York made peace with Tudor or made Tudor possible by staying exactly where she was. Sometimes the bravest act is to refuse the stage and let the audience rewrite the play without you. Sometimes that's the final move in a game you're still winning. You lift the wool cap from the pillow and feel the thimble dance along its edge where someone mended it too often. Queens suffer mending like everyone else. You set it back carefully, a crown in lower case. Outside the chamber, the abbey breathes stone holding day cold like a cellar. Candles guttering into little amber lakes, a novice snuffing wicks with the flourish of someone who enjoys a small job done well. The bedchamber does not brag. It files, it knows who came and how they left. It remembers a birth with soldiers on the doorstep, a boy carried out between promises, a woman stepping into whiteness that looked like surrender from a distance and like strategy from a step away. Twice she vanished. Twice the city pretended not to look, then looked back and found the skyline altered. You pull the coverlet up so the stitched roses are a hedge. Somewhere a bell chimes complainate, kind, inevitable. The room goes the little degree dimmer. That means sleep is making a case. Elizabeth is not here now, but the shape of her absence sits on the chair by the fire, hands folded, waiting for the moment when not being seen matters most. The corridor twists tighter. Here, walls leaning inward as if they're whispering to each other above your head. When it opens again, you step into a room that feels more like a vault than a bedchamber low-beamed ceiling. Narrow windows set deep into the stone, and the heavy scent of myrrh lingering in the air. This is Margaret of Angers' retreat, a space that was less about rest and more about resilience. Margaret's bed sits against the far wall, the canopy a deep crimson, frayed slightly along the edges but still rich enough to drink in the candlelight. A chest at the foot of the bed is half covered by a folded wool blanket, and a pair of riding boots rest nearby, their soles still dusty from the last journey. The mainstream fact is solid. As Queen Consort to Henry VI, Margaret fought fiercely to protect her son's claim during the Wars of the Roses, leading armies and navigating the cutthroat politics of England's fractured nobility. Historians still argue whether she was a heroic defender of her family's rights or a ruthless instigator prolonging the bloodshed. The fringe tidbit is quieter, less battle cry, more whisper. Some surviving household accounts hint that even on campaign, Margaret travelled with her own embroidered bed hangings, insisting they be hung wherever she lodged. To her, the bedchamber wasn't simply a place to sleep. It was a portable court, a throne room softened by fabric where alliances could be cemented over late-night bread and wine. On the small table near the hearth lies a map, corners weighted by silver candlesticks. The ink is smudged in places, a sign of hurried consultation. There's a single carved ivory pawn beside it, perhaps a charm, perhaps just the remnant of a chess set missing its companions. You can almost hear the murmur of her voice, steady and measured, weaving strategy into comfort, turning this dimly lit room into the quiet engine of a cause that would outlive her rest. The stairwell is narrow here, the kind that forces you to brush the wall for balance. When you emerge, the room ahead is small, almost monastic, but the air is heavy with the scent of clove-studded oranges and smoke from a fire that's been banked low. This is the private space of Catherine of Valois, early 15th century widow of Henry V, mother to the infant Henry VI, and a woman whose personal choices would ripple into the very roots of the Tudor dynasty. The bed is modest, its curtains of pale wool rather than silk, the kind that muffles sound instead of showing off wealth. On a small table beside it rests a carved wooden rosary, worn smooth in places, and a folded piece of parchment, with the corner darkened by an old wax seal. The mainstream fact, Catherine's secret relationship with Owen Tudor, a Welsh courtier of unremarkable birth, would eventually lead to the rise of the Tudors, outcome few could have predicted from the quiet confines of this room. Historians still argue whether the liaison began in genuine affection, political necessity, or the stubborn will of a young widow denied the right to remarry without her son's counsel's permission. A fringe tidbit survives in a court clerk's records, noting that Catherine often kept her private apartments unusually warm, perhaps to ward off her persistent illnesses, or perhaps simply to create a cocoon where she could meet those she trusted most. Tonight, you imagine her here, the fire casting flickers on the plaster. Owen perhaps seated just inside the door, speaking softly while the world beyond these walls busies itself with politics. On the coffer at the bed's foot sits a small pewter cup, half filled with cooled, spiced wine. It smells faintly of cinnamon and pepper, a drink for quiet plotting as much as comfort. This chamber may not look like a place where dynasties are born, but its walls have heard the first murmurs of one